The capital did not have a sky in the traditional sense. It had layers, soft fields of refracted starlight stretched across invisible lattices, shifting just enough to remind anyone looking up that the universe above them had been carefully edited. Rava preferred it that way. Chaos was something that existed outside her reach, and she had long ago decided that anything outside her reach was, by definition, inefficient. She stood at the center of the command chamber, her posture perfectly still, her long ears angled slightly back as streams of tactical data flowed across the curved surfaces surrounding her. The room responded to her presence like a living organism, light bending, interfaces rearranging themselves, projections aligning with her line of sight before she even turned her head. It was not loyalty. It was design. "Reposition the third orbital array," she said, her voice calm, measured, carrying no excess weight. "The enemy will attempt to probe its blind arc within the next cycle." A general to her left hesitated, just enough to be noticed. "Our simulations suggest—" "I am aware of what the simulations suggest," Rava replied, not raising her voice, which made the interruption somehow more complete. "I am also aware of what they do not account for." The general nodded quickly. "Of course, Your Majesty." Orders moved. Systems shifted. Somewhere far above, unseen mechanisms adjusted their alignment by fractions of degrees that would decide the outcome of conflicts no one in this room would ever physically witness. Rava allowed herself a brief moment of stillness, not rest, but confirmation. Everything was where it needed to be. Almost everything. Her gaze moved, just slightly, toward the far side of the chamber. He stood there as he had since his arrival 3 days ago, positioned near the secondary entrance, where the light was dimmer and the attention of others rarely lingered. The human, Dorn, assigned to her personal detail by a council that seemed increasingly determined to test the limits of her patience. He did not shift under her gaze. He did not straighten or adjust his stance in the way her own soldiers would when observed. He simply remained where he was, hands loosely clasped behind his back, expression neutral in a way that was not quite discipline and not quite indifference. Rava turned away. "Proceed," she said, and the briefing resumed. The discussion deepened, branching into layered strategies and contingencies that interlocked with one another in elegant complexity. Generals spoke in precise terms, referencing data streams that hovered in the air between them. Rava guided the conversation with minimal input, redirecting only when necessary, trimming inefficiencies before they had time to take shape. It was, in every sense, a perfect system, which was why the imperfections stood out so clearly. Near the end of the briefing, one of the senior commanders gestured toward a projected deployment map. "And the ceremonial escort will be positioned here to maintain diplomatic visibility during the transition phase." Rava followed the gesture, her eyes settling briefly on the marked position. Then, without hesitation, she spoke. "The human can remain with the escort," she said. "He is ceremonial at best." There was a pause, not long, not obvious, but enough. A faint ripple moved through the room, not laughter, not quite, but something adjacent to it, a shared understanding, lightly acknowledged and immediately suppressed. The generals were careful, they always were. Rava did not look toward the far side of the chamber. There was no reason to. The assessment had been made. The matter was closed. "Continue," she said. The briefing ended shortly after, the room gradually emptying as orders were carried outward into the vast machinery of her domain. One by one, the generals departed, their movements efficient, their expressions composed. The systems dimmed slightly, shifting into a lower state of activity. Rava remained where she was, reviewing the final projections in silence. A presence lingered. She was aware of it before she turned. Dorn stood near the exit now, not in the shadows this time, but in the open space of the doorway. He had not been dismissed. He had not been addressed. Yet he had remained. Rava's gaze settled on him, calm, assessing. "You heard the assignment," she said. "Yes, Your Majesty." His voice was even. No tension, no edge. For a brief moment, Rava considered dismissing him again, reinforcing the structure she had already established. It would have been the simplest course of action. Instead, she asked, "Do you have any objections?" It was not a question she asked often. In fact, it was not a question she asked at all. Dorn seemed to recognize this, though he gave no visible sign of it. He considered her words for a fraction of a second, then shook his head once. "No, Your Majesty." Another pause. Rava studied him more closely now, her gaze sharpening slightly. There was something unusual in the way he held himself. Not the rigid discipline of her own soldiers. Not the subtle posturing of her officers. It was simpler. Unaffected. Annoyingly so. "You may go," she said. Dorn inclined his head and turned, stepping out of the chamber without haste. The door closed behind him with a soft, precise sound. Rava stood alone again. For a moment the silence held. Then from somewhere just outside the chamber, faint but unmistakable, came a voice, one of the junior aides, speaking in a tone that suggested they believed themselves to be out of range. At least she didn't call him decorative this time. A second voice replied, quieter but no less amused. "Give it a week." Rava's ears shifted slightly. She said nothing. But somewhere in the vast, perfectly ordered system of her thoughts, a very small, very inconvenient variable refused to settle. The chamber adjusted its light as the cycle changed, shifting from the cool precision of strategic analysis to something warmer that suggested completion without ever truly allowing rest. Rava remained at her station, though the systems around her had already begun to archive the session's data into deeper layers of the network. Information never disappeared here. It simply moved somewhere quieter. Her attention was fixed on a sequence of orbital projections when the door opened again, this time with the subtle announcement reserved for internal staff rather than military command. One of her aides entered, carrying a thin data slab with both hands, as though it required ceremonial handling. It did not. The aide simply enjoyed the performance. "Your Majesty," the aide said, bowing just enough to satisfy protocol without committing to sincerity. "A file has been delivered to your desk." Rava did not turn immediately. "Then it has been delivered." "Yes, Your Majesty," the aide replied. There was a pause, a carefully placed one. It seemed relevant. Rava's eyes shifted, finally acknowledging the aide with a brief glance. "Everything is relevant." The aide inclined their head, but there was a flicker of something in their expression. Amusement, perhaps, or anticipation poorly disguised as professionalism. "Of course," they said. "This one may be more immediately relevant." Rava considered dismissing them. Instead, she extended a hand slightly. The slab lifted from the aide's grasp and glided across the air, guided by an unseen field, until it settled precisely where she would have reached for it anyway. The aide stepped back, clearly satisfied with the delivery. "Shall I?" they began. "No." The word was quiet, but final. The aide bowed again, this time with less restraint, and turned to leave. As the door closed behind them, there was a faint sound, something suspiciously close to a suppressed chuckle. Rava ignored it. She activated the file. For a moment, nothing unusual presented itself. A name, a designation, basic identifiers, human, auxiliary assignment, recently transferred, Dorn. Rava almost closed it. Then the record expanded. 23 engagements. She did not react immediately. Her expression did not change. Her posture did not shift. Only her eyes moved, scanning the entries with the same calm efficiency she applied to all information. The first engagement, a border conflict, minor in scale, resolved in under 3 cycles. Victory. The second, a supply route ambush, initially classified as a loss until revised after a delayed transmission, clarified the outcome. Victory. The third. Rava slowed. Her gaze sharpened, the data streams around her dimming slightly as the system adjusted to her focus. Engagement 14. She recognized it, not immediately by name, but by pattern. A conflict she had overseen in its later stages, one that had resisted clean resolution despite precise planning. The final shift in its outcome had been attributed to external disruption. The report had been vague, incomplete. Now it was not. Dorn had been there, not as a primary commander, not even as a listed strategic asset. His role was recorded as field adjustment, a phrase so deliberately understated it bordered on insult. Rava continued. Engagement 19. Again, familiar. This one she remembered clearly. A situation that had nearly escalated beyond control before abruptly stabilizing under circumstances no one had fully explained at the time. Dorn. Again. Rava leaned back slightly, her long ears angling outward as if catching something just beyond the reach of sound. This was inconvenient. She read the file again, slower. There were notes attached now, secondary annotations from observers, commanders, analysts. They were inconsistent in tone, but remarkably consistent in outcome. Unorthodox execution, deviation from standard protocol, effective. One entry stood out, a brief comment from a retired officer, archived with no official classification. He doesn't win loudly. That's why people forget he's winning. Rava's fingers moved slightly, pausing over the interface. For the first time since opening the file, she did not immediately proceed. Instead, she sat in silence. Somewhere in the chamber, a system recalibrated its light, shifting the reflections across the polished surfaces. The movement was subtle, but noticeable. Rava closed the file, then opened it again. The data did not change. That was perhaps the most irritating part. A soft chime sounded at the edge of her awareness. A notification from one of the outer systems. Routine, predictable. Rava dismissed it without looking. Her attention returned to the file. 23 victories. She considered the number carefully, as if expecting it to reveal some hidden inconsistency under prolonged observation. It did not. The door opened again. This time, Rava did not need to turn to know who it was. The same aide stepped inside, their posture composed, their expression carefully neutral. "Your Majesty," they said, "do you require—" "No." The aide stopped. Another pause. Then cautiously, "Is the file satisfactory?" Rava's gaze lifted, settling on them with precise intensity. "It is accurate," she said. The aide nodded, though their eyes flickered with something dangerously close to curiosity. "That is usually the goal," they replied. Another pause. Longer this time. The aide shifted slightly as if debating whether to speak again. They chose poorly. "It is interesting," they said, "how certain details can be overlooked." Rava did not respond immediately. When she did, her voice was calm. "Are you suggesting that my oversight is flawed?" The aide straightened instantly. "No, Your Majesty." "Good." Silence fell again. The aide remained where they were, clearly aware that leaving too quickly might be interpreted as guilt, but staying too long was equally dangerous. Rava watched them for a moment longer, then made a small, almost imperceptible gesture. "You may go." The aide bowed and turned, moving toward the exit with careful efficiency. Just before the door closed, they hesitated, only for a fraction of a second, then said without turning back, "For what it is worth, Your Majesty, I placed the file myself." Rava did not ask why. The door closed. The chamber was silent again. Rava looked down at the file once more. Then, with deliberate precision, she issued a command. "Summon Dorn." The system acknowledged instantly. Somewhere in the vast structure of the capital, a message was delivered. Rava stood, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. But beneath that composure, something had shifted. Not dramatically, not visibly, just enough to be noticed, if one knew where to look. The summons moved faster than sound. Not literally, of course. Rava did not tolerate inefficiency disguised as poetry, but the effect was similar. Within moments of her command, the capital's internal network adjusted, rewrote, and delivered a single, precise instruction to a man who had spent most of his time here, being politely ignored. Dorn arrived without announcement. The chamber recognized him as it did everything else, by function, not by importance. The door opened just enough to admit him, then sealed again with a quiet certainty, as if the room itself was curious to see what would happen next. Rava did not turn immediately. She stood before a wide arc of suspended projections, their light reflecting faintly along the sharp lines of her posture. The file was still open, though now reduced to a narrow column at the edge of her vision, as if it were attempting to behave like something unimportant. It failed. "You were summoned," she said. "Yes, Your Majesty." His voice carried the same tone it always had. No tension, no hesitation, no subtle note of, "I assume you have finally read the file." Rava found that unhelpful. She turned. For the first time since his arrival in her domain, she looked at him with full, deliberate attention. He stood as before, hands behind his back, posture straight but not rigid, his expression neutral in a way that suggested neither deference nor defiance. It was, Rava realized, the expression of someone who had already decided who he was and saw no need to negotiate it. Annoyingly efficient. "You have an extensive record," she said. Dorn nodded once. "Yes, Your Majesty." That was all. Rava waited. Nothing followed. No elaboration, no clarification, no attempt to guide the conversation toward any particular conclusion. Rava narrowed her eyes slightly. "You did not consider it relevant to mention?" "No, Your Majesty." "Why?" It was not a question. It was a demand shaped like one. Dorn considered it for a moment, as if weighing how much of an answer was necessary. "No one asked," he said. Silence. Rava blinked once. The answer was technically correct, which made it deeply unsatisfying. She stepped closer, the projection shifting subtly to accommodate her movement. The chamber adjusted its focus, narrowing the field of light around the two of them, as if the entire system had decided this conversation was now the most important process running. "You were present in engagements 14 and 19, she said. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Those outcomes were classified as external disruptions." Dorn nodded. "That sounds accurate." Rava's ears angled slightly forward. "You are the disruption." There was a pause. Dorn tilted his head, just a fraction. "That has been said before." Rava stared at him. For a moment, the silence stretched, not tense, but uncertain. Not because Rava did not know what to say, but because the usual structure of conversation had somehow failed to apply. She shifted tactics. "Explain engagement 14. Dorn's gaze moved briefly to the projection, then back to her. "The enemy expected a direct advance," he said. "So I didn't do that." Rava waited. "That is your explanation." "Yes, Your Majesty." Another pause. Rava felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of her composure. It was not frustration, not quite. It was resistance, as if the conversation itself refused to align with her expectations. "Be specific," she said. Dorn nodded. "We approached from an angle they considered inefficient. It delayed us slightly, but it also meant they were not prepared when we arrived." Rava processed this. "That is a simplification." "Yes, Your Majesty." "You reduced a multi-phase engagement to, 'we went somewhere else.'" Dorn considered that. "When you say it like that, it does sound less impressive." Rava did not react. She absolutely did not. "Engagement 19, she said. Dorn's expression shifted, barely, but enough to be noticed. "That one was more complicated," he said. "Explain." He paused. "The enemy commander made a mistake." "All commanders make mistakes." "This one tripped." Rava blinked again. "Tripped." "Yes, Your Majesty." "Physically." "Yes." Rava stared at him. The projections around them flickered slightly, as if the system itself was unsure how to process this information. "You are suggesting that a critical turning point in a major engagement was caused by a loss of balance?" "Yes, Your Majesty." Silence. Then from somewhere deep within the chamber's automated systems, a soft tone sounded. A minor alert, triggered by something entirely unrelated. It felt, for a brief moment, like the room was attempting to clear its throat. Rava ignored it. "You built a strategy around this." "No, Your Majesty. That part was unexpected." "Then how did you win?" Dorn shrugged, a small, almost casual movement that would have been unthinkable from any of her own officers. "We adapted." Rava studied him. There it was again. That pattern. No emphasis, no embellishment, just outcome. Efficient. Inconveniently so. She turned away, her gaze returning to the projections, though her focus had shifted. "You were assigned to my detail as a ceremonial presence," she said. "Yes, Your Majesty." "That assessment was incomplete." Dorn said nothing. Rava waited. Still nothing. She exhaled slowly, a controlled release of air that signaled adjustment rather than frustration. "You will remain present during strategic briefing," she said. "You will provide input when requested." "Yes, Your Majesty." Another pause. Rava hesitated, not visibly, not in a way that anyone else would have noticed. But it was there, a fraction of a second where the next words did not arrive as easily as they should have. "You are not ceremonial," she said. The words felt unfamiliar. Dorn inclined his head slightly. Understood. Rava turned back to him. You will be evaluated based on your actual function. Yes, Your Majesty. Silence settled again, but this time it was different. Not empty, not uncertain, just quieter. From beyond the chamber doors, faintly, came the sound of voices. Low, indistinct, carrying just enough through the structure to suggest that the outside world was still moving, still watching, still placing quiet bets on outcomes they did not fully understand. Inside, Rava studied Dorn one last time. Then with a small, precise motion, she dismissed him. You may go. Dorn turned and stepped toward the exit. Just before the door opened, he paused. Not long, just enough. Then he said, without turning back, For what it's worth, Your Majesty, I didn't think I was ceremonial either. The door opened, closed, silence returned. Rava stood alone, and for the first time in a very long time, she adjusted a variable she had once considered fixed. The next briefing began before the capital had fully finished rearranging itself from the last one, as if the entire structure had decided that rest was an inefficient suggestion rather than a necessity. Walls shifted, interfaces reformed, and the chamber reassembled its layers of data into a new configuration of controlled urgency. Rava stood at the center again, unchanged in posture, unchanged in presence, yet the space around her felt subtly recalibrated. This time, Dorn stood inside the circle of light, not at the doorway, not near the shadows where attention dissolved. He was positioned slightly behind and to her right, close enough to be included, far enough to remain unintrusive. It was a precise placement, deliberate. The generals noticed. Of course they did. Their reactions were minimal. Controlled nods, brief glances that vanished the moment they were acknowledged. But the shift registered. In Rava's court, position was language. And today the sentence had changed. Begin, Rava said. A projection unfolded, displaying a border system under strain. Multiple incursions, unpredictable vectors, the kind of situation that resisted clean solutions and quietly punished overconfidence. A senior commander stepped forward, gesturing toward the shifting data. The enemy has begun fragmenting their approach patterns. They are avoiding direct confrontation, instead targeting logistical nodes. They are testing response time, Rava said, cutting through the explanation with quiet precision. The commander inclined his head. Yes, Your Majesty. Rava's gaze moved across the projections, tracing potential paths, probabilities branching and collapsing in rapid succession. They will escalate once they identify a consistent delay. Another commander spoke. We have prepared a multi-phase response to counter. I see it, Rava said. The plan unfolded in front of her, elegant and complex, each phase aligning with the next in a sequence of calculated control. It was objectively a strong strategy. Rava let the silence stretch for a moment, then without turning she said, Dorn. The room shifted, not physically, not visibly, but something tightened in the attention of everyone present. Dorn stepped forward slightly. Yes, Your Majesty. Rava gestured toward the projection. Your assessment. There was a pause. Not hesitation. Consideration. Dorn studied the display, his gaze moving across the layered data with a quiet focus that lacked the usual performative intensity of the others. He was not trying to impress anyone. He was simply looking. After a moment, he said, It's a good plan. One of the generals allowed himself the smallest breath of relief. Then Dorn added, They'll expect it. The relief disappeared. Rava's ears angled slightly forward. Explain. Dorn gestured lightly toward one section of the projection. If I can see the pattern, they can see it too. Maybe not exactly like this, but close enough. A commander frowned. You're suggesting we abandon a fully structured response based on the assumption that the enemy is equally perceptive. Dorn shrugged. I'm suggesting they're not completely incompetent. There was a faint sound from somewhere in the room, something that might have been a suppressed cough or a poorly timed attempt at not laughing. Rava did not look toward it. What would you propose? She asked. Dorn considered the projection again. Do less. Silence. One of the generals blinked. That is not a strategy. Dorn nodded. That's what makes it useful. Rava watched him closely. Clarify, she said. Dorn pointed to a cluster of nodes near the edge of the system. They're spreading out to test response time, right? So instead of reacting everywhere, we don't react at all. At least not immediately. A commander stepped forward. Allowing them to operate unchallenged would compromise. Only if they know we're not watching, Dorn said. Another pause. Rava's gaze sharpened. Continue. They're probing for patterns, Dorn said. So we give them one. A slow response. Predictable. Slightly inefficient. He gestured again, tracing an imaginary path through the projection. They'll adjust to it. Start committing more resources. That's when we stop being predictable. One of the generals frowned deeply. You are suggesting we deliberately appear less efficient. Dorn nodded. Just for a bit. The general looked physically uncomfortable. That is deeply unsettling. I get that a lot, Dorn said. This time the sound in the room was unmistakable. A brief stifled laugh that someone failed to fully suppress. Rava ignored it. Her attention remained fixed on Dorn. You are proposing controlled inefficiency as a strategic tool, she said. Yes, Your Majesty. That contradicts standard doctrine. Yes. Rava was silent for a moment. The projections shifted subtly, recalculating probabilities based on the new input. Paths changed. Outcomes adjusted. The system, impartial as always, did not care that the method felt inelegant. It only cared that it worked. Rava stepped closer to the display, her gaze moving through the revised projections. The numbers aligned, not perfectly, not cleanly, but effectively. She turned slightly. Implement the adjustment. The commanders hesitated, only for a fraction of a second. Then almost in unison, Yes, Your Majesty. Orders moved, systems responded. The plan shifted. Rava remained where she was, watching as the new strategy took shape. After a moment, she spoke again. Dorn. Yes, Your Majesty. You will remain present for future briefings. A pause, then. Understood. Rava considered him briefly, then added, Your input will be requested when relevant. Dorn nodded. I'll try to be relevant. There it was again. That tone. Not arrogance, not false modesty, just simplicity. Rava turned back to the projections, but something in her expression had changed. Not visibly. Not enough for anyone to comment on. But it was there. Behind her, one of the junior officers leaned slightly toward another and whispered, just quietly enough to almost escape detection. Do you think this counts as a promotion or a warning? The other considered it. I think it's both. Rava did not turn, but her ears shifted slightly, and this time she did not completely ignore it. The chamber was quieter than usual, though not in a way that suggested peace. It was the kind of quiet that came before something decided to misbehave. Rava stood before a narrower set of projections this time. The vast complexity of her empire reduced, temporarily, to a single problem that refused to remain contained. A border system flickered at the edge of stability. Signals came in bursts, then vanished. Ships appeared where they should not, then dissolved into sensor noise that behaved almost like a deliberate insult. Report, Rava said. A communications officer stepped forward, visibly trying to look less concerned than he actually was. We are receiving intermittent contact from Outpost K-17. Their transmissions are inconsistent. Inconsistent, Rava repeated. Yes, Your Majesty. At one point, they reported a full incursion. Moments later, they claimed everything was normal and asked if we had received their lunch request. A pause, Rava turned slightly. Their lunch request. Yes, Your Majesty. From somewhere behind her, Dorn spoke. That's usually a bad sign. Several heads turned. Rava did not. Clarify, she said. Dorn stepped forward just enough to be heard without interrupting the structure of the room. If a unit under pressure suddenly mentions something irrelevant, it usually means either their systems are compromised or they're trying to signal something indirectly. The communications officer frowned. Or they are confused. Dorn nodded. That too. But I prefer assuming they're not completely useless. The officer hesitated. That is reassuring. It's not meant to be, Dorn said. There was a brief, dangerous pause where someone almost laughed. Rava moved closer to the projection. The system expanded, revealing fragmented sensor data, distorted signals, and a pattern that did not quite settle into anything predictable. They are being probed, she said. Yes, Your Majesty, one of the generals replied. But the method is unusual. The enemy is not committing fully. They are testing. Rava's ears angled slightly forward. Testing what? The general hesitated. Our response. Rava's gaze shifted briefly to Dorn. Of course they are, Dorn said quietly. Everyone tests the response first. The general frowned. You speak as if this is expected. Dorn shrugged. It is. You don't walk into a room without checking if the floor is solid. This is not a room, the general said. Dorn glanced at the projection. It is if you're about to fall through it. Another pause. Rava watched the data streams, her mind moving through possibilities with practiced precision. The pattern was there. It was just obscured, deliberately. They are not probing for weakness, she said slowly. They are probing for behavior. The room stilled. Dorn nodded once. Yes. Rava turned slightly. You anticipated this. I expected something like it, Dorn said. They adjusted after the last engagement. This is the next step. One of the commanders stepped forward. Then we respond with force. We eliminate the probes before they can gather. No, Rava said. The word cut cleanly through the room. We do not react yet. The commander blinked. Your Majesty? Rava's gaze returned to the projection. They are observing. Let them observe. The commander hesitated. That would allow them to gather data on our systems. Yes. And our response times. Yes. And our... Yes. Silence. Dorn spoke again, his tone calm. If we react now, they learn what we do under pressure. If we don't react, they learn nothing useful. The commander frowned. They will assume we are weak. Dorn nodded. Good. The commander stared at him. Good? Yes, Dorn said. People who assume things tend to commit to them. Rava's ears shifted slightly. The projection adjusted again, running simulations based on the current input. The outcomes branched, probabilities shifting as the system attempted to reconcile the absence of immediate response. It did not like it. That was, in itself, informative. Rava stepped closer, her reflection briefly merging with the light of the data. Prepare a delayed response pattern, she said. Minimal engagement. Controlled visibility. The commanders moved, though not without visible discomfort. Orders were issued, systems adjusted, and the structure of their reaction, normally immediate and precise, was intentionally slowed. One of the junior officers leaned slightly toward another, whispering just quietly enough to almost escape notice. We are deliberately doing less. The other nodded. I feel incorrect. Dorn, without looking at them, said, You get used to it. The officer straightened instantly. Rava did not turn. Her focus remained on the shifting projections. But there was a subtle change in her expression, something sharper, more attentive. Deploy a single patrol unit, she said. Make it visible. A general nodded. And if they engage? Rava paused. Then, they will. The general waited. Rava's gaze flicked briefly toward Dorn. Then we learn, she said. Dorn added. And they think they're winning. The general looked between them. Are they not? Dorn smiled slightly, though it was barely noticeable. Not in a way that matters. Another pause. This time no one tried to suppress the reaction. It wasn't laughter exactly. More like the beginning of understanding, arriving in pieces. The communications officer spoke again. Outpost K-17 has sent another transmission. Rava did not look away from the projection. Display it. The message appeared, fragmented, distorted, but readable. Status normal. No threats detected. Also, we are still waiting on the lunch confirmation. A beat. Dorn tilted his head. They're definitely compromised. The officer nodded slowly. Yes, that seems likely. Rava watched the message for a moment longer, then said, Maintain current approach. The system acknowledged. The chamber settled into a new rhythm. Not calm, not tense, but something in between. A controlled uncertainty. Rava stood at the center of it, her posture unchanged, her presence steady. But this time, the system around her was not perfectly aligned, and for the first time, she allowed it. Behind her, Dorn remained where he was, quiet, observant, entirely unbothered by the subtle discomfort of everyone else. After a moment, one of the junior officers whispered again, I think I understand it now. The other glanced at him. Understand what? The officer hesitated. Why he wins? Dorn, without turning, said, "It's mostly luck." The officer blinked. "That doesn't sound right." Dorn shrugged. "It helps." Rava's ears shifted slightly, and this time she did not correct him. The first real strike came quietly, which made it far more offensive. No dramatic surge of energy signatures, no fleet emerging in perfect formation, no declaration of intent. Just a flicker, barely noticeable, at the edge of the monitored system. A patrol unit went silent for exactly 3 seconds, then returned as if nothing had happened. 3 seconds was a very long time. "Report," Rava said. The command chamber sharpened instantly, light tightening, projections realigning into a focused cluster of data that refused to behave politely. A systems analyst stepped forward, already mid-sentence. The patrol unit experienced a localized signal disruption. No damage reported, no loss of function, but their sensor logs. "Corrupted," Dorn said. The analyst blinked. "Yes." Rava's gaze moved across the projection, isolating the anomaly. "Not corrupted," she said. "Altered." The distinction settled heavily. Dorn nodded slightly. "They're not breaking things. They're adjusting them." One of the generals stepped closer, clearly uncomfortable. "To what end?" Dorn gestured toward the patrol's recorded path. "They want us to trust what we see." The general frowned. "We always trust our systems." Dorn looked at him. "That's the problem." A brief silence followed, the kind that suggested someone had just stepped on an invisible structural weakness. Rava did not hesitate. "Lock external sensor feeds. Cross-reference with internal telemetry only." The system complied instantly, recalibrating its data streams. The projections shifted again, losing some of their clarity but gaining something far more useful: consistency. Another flicker, this time a different patrol, then another. "Pattern confirmed," the analyst said. "They are targeting observation points, not assets." "They are rewriting the battlefield," Rava said. Dorn added, "They're making it look like nothing is happening." The general glanced at the projections. "But something is happening." "Yes," Dorn said. "That's why it works." Rava stepped forward, her long ears angled slightly forward, her focus narrowing to a single point of convergence in the data. "They are preparing for escalation," she said. One of the commanders nodded. "Then we respond now. Full engagement. We eliminate—" "No." The word landed with quiet certainty. The commander hesitated. "Your Majesty, if we delay—" "They are expecting us to react," Rava said. "They have designed this entire sequence to provoke it." Dorn crossed his arms slightly, watching the projections. "If we react now, we confirm their assumptions." The commander frowned. "And if we do nothing?" Dorn shrugged. "We make them uncomfortable." "That is not a measurable advantage. It is if they start making mistakes." Rava considered this, her gaze shifting between the data and Dorn's expression, which remained frustratingly unchanged. Another alert chimed. This time it was not subtle. A burst of activity surged across the projection, multiple signals appearing at once, overlapping, conflicting, refusing to settle into anything coherent. "They're committing," the analyst said, his voice tightening. "Multiple vectors. We cannot confirm exact numbers." "Because the numbers are wrong," Dorn said. The analyst looked at him. "What?" "They're showing us what they want us to see," Dorn said. "Not what's actually there." The general stepped forward. "Then how do we determine—" "We don't," Dorn said. Silence. The general stared at him. "That is not helpful." "It's honest," Dorn replied. Rava's eyes narrowed slightly. "Explain," she said. Dorn gestured toward the projection, though his attention was not fully on it. "If the data is unreliable, we stop relying on it. We shift to behavior." The analyst blinked. "Behavior?" Dorn nodded. "They've been consistent. Subtle disruptions, gradual escalation, controlled pressure. This," he pointed at the chaotic projection, "doesn't match that pattern." The room stilled. Rava's gaze sharpened. "It is a distraction." "Yes," Dorn said. "A loud one." Another pause. Then Rava spoke, her voice precise. "Reduce response to minimal levels. Maintain current patrol patterns. Do not engage the visible targets." The general stepped forward again, unable to fully contain his concern. "Your Majesty, they are advancing." Rava turned her head slightly. "Are they?" The general hesitated. The projection flickered again. The signal shifted. For a brief moment, the entire display seemed to hesitate. Then several of the markers disappeared. Not destroyed. Gone. The analyst stared. They're withdrawing. Dorn nodded. The loud part is over. The general frowned. But we did nothing. Dorn glanced at him. Exactly. A faint sound moved through the room. Not quite relief, not quite confusion. Something in between. Rava watched the projection stabilize, the chaotic signals resolving into something quieter, more controlled. They tested our reaction, she said. And didn't get one, Dorn added. One of the junior officers, unable to stop himself, muttered, That feels, rude. Dorn smiled slightly. It usually does. The officer blinked. To them or to us? Dorn considered that. Yes. There was a brief, unexpected laugh from somewhere in the room. Even the general exhaled slightly, though he quickly composed himself. Rava remained still, her gaze fixed on the now stable projection. The system had returned to order, but it was not the same order as before. She turned slightly, her attention shifting to Dorn. You anticipated this, she said. Dorn shook his head. I guessed. That is not the same. No, Dorn agreed, but it's close enough sometimes. Rava studied him for a moment longer. Then, without looking away, she issued her next command. Prepare a counterpattern. The room stilled again. The analyst spoke carefully. A counterpattern? Yes, Rava said. We will give them something to observe. Dorn tilted his head slightly. That sounds dangerous. Rava's ears shifted. It is, she said. A pause. Then Dorn nodded. Good. Another quiet reaction moved through the room, this time less restrained, more aware. Rava turned back to the projection, her posture unchanged, her expression composed. But something had shifted again. Not in the system, not in the data. In her. Behind her, Dorn remained where he was, watching the same projection, the same patterns, the same quiet space where something had almost happened. After a moment, one of the junior officers whispered, I think I preferred it when things were clearly dangerous. The other nodded. This feels complicated. Dorn said, without turning, It always was. Rava did not correct him, and this time neither did anyone else. The capital did not change all at once. It never did. It adjusted. Subtle shifts moved through its architecture, its systems, its people. Small recalibrations that only became obvious when something no longer fit the way it used to. Rava stood once again before the living window of her command chamber, the artificial sky bending starlight into something quieter than reality. But for the first time in a long while, she was not looking at it as something to control. She was looking at it as something that could not be fully predicted. Behind her, the chamber moved at a slower rhythm than before. Not inefficient, never that, but less rigid. The projections no longer snapped instantly into perfect alignment. They flowed, adjusted, allowed for variance. It was unsettling and effective. Report, Rava said. A systems officer stepped forward, noticeably more relaxed than his predecessors had been in previous cycles. The outer systems have stabilized, Your Majesty. The probing patterns have ceased. Ceased, Rava repeated. Yes, the enemy has withdrawn beyond monitored range. No further distortions detected. Dorn, standing at his usual position, though that position had long since shifted from background detail to something less easily categorized, spoke quietly. They didn't withdraw, he said. They stopped trying. The officer blinked. There is a difference, Dorn nodded. A small one. Rava turned slightly, her gaze settling on Dorn. Explain. Dorn shrugged. They tested us. They didn't get what they expected, so they'll rethink things before trying again. A pause, the officer frowned. That does not sound like a victory. Dorn considered that. It depends on what you expected to win. The officer hesitated, clearly deciding that further questions might lead somewhere uncomfortable, and stepped back. Rava turned back to the projection, watching the now stable system. No distortions, no false signals, no subtle manipulations bending perception into something unreliable. Just quiet. For a moment she said nothing, then, archive the current response patterns. The system acknowledged. We will retain this approach for future engagements. Another officer spoke cautiously. As standard protocol? Rava paused. The word standard lingered in the air, slightly out of place. No, she said. The room stilled. This is not standard, Rava continued. It is adaptable. The officer nodded, though his expression suggested he would need time to understand the difference. Behind her, Dorn shifted slightly. Standard would be easier. Rava glanced at him. Easier is not the objective. Dorn smiled faintly. It usually isn't. There was a small, quiet ripple of amusement through the room. Not forced, not suppressed. It came and went naturally, like something that had finally been given permission to exist. Rava turned fully now, facing the chamber. Her court, her system, and something in it had changed, not weakened, not disordered, just expanded. You will all adjust your expectations, she said, her voice steady, precise. Efficiency remains essential, but it is not singular. There are variations. A junior officer, clearly forgetting himself for just a moment, muttered, That sounds complicated. Dorn, without looking at him, said, It is. The officer straightened immediately. Rava's ears shifted slightly, but she did not correct either of them. Instead, she stepped forward, closing the distance between herself and the center of the chamber. For a long time, she said, I believed that precision required certainty, that control required complete understanding. She paused. That assessment was incomplete. Silence followed, not uncomfortable, not tense, just attentive. Rava's gaze moved across the room, settling briefly on each of them before returning, inevitably, to Dorn. You operate differently, she said. Dorn nodded. Yes, Your Majesty. You accept uncertainty. Yes. You rely on variables that cannot be fully measured. Yes. Rava studied him for a moment longer. Then carefully, as if adjusting a structure that had never been meant to move, she said, That approach has proven effective. Dorn inclined his head slightly. Thank you. There was a pause. Rava could have stopped there. For most rulers, that would have been more than enough. But she did not. Your presence, she said, her voice still precise, still controlled, but undeniably different, is no longer considered ceremonial. A faint shift moved through the room. Dorn met her gaze. Understood. Another pause. Rava held it. Then, with deliberate intent, she added, It is valued. The words settled into the space between them. It did not echo. It did not demand attention. But it stayed. Dorn nodded once. That's less terrible than expected. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. Then someone, no one would later admit who, let out a quiet, involuntary laugh. It spread just slightly, not enough to disrupt order, just enough to exist. Rava did not stop it. She did not encourage it either. She simply allowed it. The chamber adjusted again, its systems continuing their quiet work, its structure holding steady while no longer pretending to be perfectly rigid. Outside, the artificial sky shifted, revealing a clearer view of the real stars beyond the veil. Unpredictable, uncontrolled. Still there. Rava turned back toward the window, her posture unchanged, her presence as precise as it had always been. But now there was space within that precision, room for variance, for uncertainty, for things that did not fit neatly into a single calculation. Behind her, the chamber continued to function, efficient, adaptive, alive. Dorn remained where he was, neither central nor peripheral, exactly where he needed to be. After a moment, one of the junior officers leaned toward another and whispered, So, what happens now? The other thought about it. I think we do the same thing. A pause. Just differently. Dorn, without turning, said, That's usually how it works. Rava's ears shifted slightly, and this time she allowed herself the smallest, quietest smile.